Hi everyone, and welcome to week 5, in which we will be discussing fans in the context of consumption, leading on from your discussion of consumption and shopping last week. So what we're going to be looking at a few different things, and I've got a few extra videos this week. I will ask you to watch these and also ask you to sort of switch back and forth to watch various clips that are on the playlist. So I'll ask you to pause this, maybe open another tab or another window to play the playlist videos on, and also to comment on the video to a couple of questions that I ask. So let's start off with the question of how to define a fan. Okay, so there are a couple of different ways to define fans. Most of them, I guess, rest in a fairly negative context historically. So you'll see this first definition here of a fan as a fanatic, and that's where the term is derived from. A keen follower or regular spectator, usually of a sport, or in generally an enthusiast or hobbyist. If we see that a fan is a fanatic, how do we define a fanatic? As characterized, influenced, or prompted by excessive, you note these words, excessive and mistaken enthusiasm, or a mad person. So while of course you can be a fan of anything, and the term was in these uses focused on sports, fandom of popular culture becomes ever bigger, and I think the term fan is often used in that particular context today about popular culture, about music, sports, and so forth as they fit into that. Now, this is not a new thing. Some people feel that fandoms only exist as a result of the internet. That is not the case. If you look back to enormous stars, so in the silent film era, for example, Rudolph Valentino, his death brought many fans to his funeral, and there were many publications and so forth throughout that time of fans and discussion of different celebrity and actors' lives and so forth. So if you now switch to the playlist, does that come up? You will see that this video is at the top. If you could watch approximately the first minute of that just to get a sense of the crowds, and then come back to this video. So something important to note then, as is the case today, is that fans are often involved not only in passionate consumption of the object of their fandom, but also in the production of cultural products, whether these be magazines, art, fiction, music, and so forth. We will talk in more detail about this in one of the later videos, and this sort of brings up questions of power and consumption versus production and so forth. The idea that it's maybe not as straightforward a relationship as we might initially think. So if we think about it, what is the difference between being a fan and simply liking something? Do you have to produce something? Do you have to have a blog about it to be a proper fan? Can you simply be a fan by yourself? These are all kind of questions that come up, and I often hear in my classes students say, well, I really like XYZ, but I'm not a fan of it. So you can you can sort of see that there can often be a sort of a hierarchy involved, that students don't want to be associated with, or people in general don't want to be associated with certain things that they might actually deep down secretly like, and or not want to be seen as having this sort of excessive, mad enthusiasm that is listed as one of the definitions of being a fan, being a fanatic. So is it a question of scale and passion? Is it a question of what kind of thing it is that you're looking at or that you really, really like? And often it comes down to this idea of it being a perception of excess, of being too much in some way, or potentially the idea that there is a dissolution of boundaries between the self and the other, so that there is, I guess, a breakdown between the person who likes the thing and the thing itself. So if we then think about consumption practices in relation to this, what constitutes a normal consumption practice in relation to popular culture, and what is the abnormal one? And I'm using abnormal in a non-judgmental, but in how people might see it way. What is the one that demarcates, I guess, fan consumption as opposed to other forms of consumption? Is buying a Harry Potter t-shirt make you a fan? Or going to Harry Potter theme park and getting a wand and all this sort of stuff, does that make you a fan? Where is the line, I guess? Is buying a DVD then, not the case, because you're just consuming it simply? So I guess these are the sorts of questions that come up in terms of consumption and fandom when you're looking at them. Another question is whether the definition of fan is shaped by what the object of the fandom is. So if we look, for example, you might say you're a fan of chocolate, as I certainly am, versus something like popular culture, a particular form of popular culture, versus something like opera. We don't always say someone's an opera fan, tend to use, aficionado and so forth, or at least it's perceived in a different way. And this tends to have a lot to do with class, that things that are perceived as being, more upper class tend to be seen as more worthy, and thus lots of enthusiasm for them is seen as more worthy and less problematic, perhaps. This is not, I guess, a fair thing, but it is certainly something we think about. And I'd challenge you to have a think about whether or not these kinds of definitions, these kinds of hierarchies do shape how you view fans and fandom. So this video is also on the playlist of The Big Bang Theory. And what I would ask you to do is go and watch this and think about how fandom is being characterized, defined in this representation. And then come back. So this is particularly the case with Big Bang Theory, but what, in relation to Big Bang Theory, but other texts as well, what does it mean to love a popular cultural phenomenon? Whether this be a person, a celebrity, as in the case of Rudolph Valentino, or a text like Lord of the Rings and the ring from it in the last clip, or potentially a particular kind of product. So you might have noticed in that clip Raj saying, "God, are we nerdy?" and this idea of them being perhaps obsessed or uncritical of their consumption. So this is a very common characterization in popular culture. Even though popular culture encourages fandom, it also often makes fun of fandom. So Jolie Jensen is a really good scholar in this area, if you wanted to look up more of her work. And the idea is that fandom is characterized as being an excess of emotion, whereas studying something, ultimately academics are to some degree fans of something. You know, I wouldn't be lecturing on popular culture if I didn't love it. You know, your English lecturer would not be lecturing on Shakespeare if they didn't love it. But the cool, detached rationality of the scholar tends to be put aside as different. And I guess that difference is characterized by, and keep this in mind for your essays, being able to kind of make a reasoned argument and kind of weigh up things. But that's not to say that that fans are necessarily uncritical. In fact, they're often very critical, as we'll explore later. So as I was mentioning before, there tends to also be this high and low culture split. And sometimes this can get confused. So for example, Lord of the Rings, despite being fantasy literature, which is often associated with fandom, was considered to be a more high culture text than when the films were made. They were considered to be more low culture. So I guess there was a division there in terms of how those fans came to be seen. Go over to the playlist now and watch this video. This is a public official complaining about the Beatles appearing a long time ago and characterizing the fans in particular kinds of ways. And this kind of fandom is often, this kind of discussion of fandom that is taking place in this clip is often characterized along gendered lines in terms of fandoms that attract a lot of women audiences are often seen as more problematic, more hysterical, and so forth. So go and watch that and come back. So why study fans? So fans came to prominence in terms of study, in terms of audience studies, in the context of cultural studies. The most famous author in the area is called Henry Jenkins, and he wrote a famous book called Textual Poachers. And that explored the idea that audiences don't just receive popular cultural messages, they actually take those messages and make their own thing out of it, or respond to it in their own kinds of ways. As we've had developments in technologies since the early 90s when Jenkins started writing in this area, the internet has enabled a lot more sort of fan production, which fits into these ideas. And popular culture itself has acknowledged the consumption power of fans and harnessed it to make further money in many cases, as in sort of voting for reality TV and embedding into their shows Twitter responses and these sorts of things that make you feel that the audience has power in relationship, and to some extent the audience does have some power. But if you think about it as well, the audience, that power is very much mediated by the show. So how are we going for time? So as I was saying, there's often hierarchies of fandom put forward. This is particularly the case as between something like sports fandom versus TV fandom. Being a Knights fan and being a Game of Thrones fan are often put into a particular kind of hierarchy. You can tell me what you think that is in the comments. And I guess even within something like sports fandom, there is the idea that there's socially acceptable fandom. So buying the jerseys and doing all these sorts of things and paying to go to the game. So the exclusively consuming type, and also the idea of, you know, violent soccer crowds and these sorts of things that are potentially going into that, taking it too far, emotion sort of territory. A combination of these sorts of things are of course, in the rise of Quidditch as a sport. There's a video about that on the playlist if you want to find out more. And there is, of course, a team at this university, so maybe some of you are members of that team. But an interesting example of fan power was recently in the Australian Soccer League, where the fans of the Western Sydney Wanderers boycotted and protested and walked out of games in protest at some fans being banned and the way that fans were banned and that they didn't have a right of appeal and so forth. So this video is not in the playlist, but if you go to the website on the screen, you will, or search for the name of that article, you will find there's a video there that kind of goes through what happened in that respect. So I guess this is a case of where fans have sort of made their voice heard and actually been fairly successful in having in getting a response from, I guess, the owners of the object of their fandom. Texts tend to promote other texts, TV shows promote other TV shows, and all these sorts of things. So self-referentiality and intertextuality, which I spoke about in week 2, are very important. And just as a fun clip, this is from it's on the playlist. This is from Parks and Recreation, and talking about containing many Game of Thrones references. And I'd challenge you, as you are watching television or radio or so forth this week, to note where different things are referencing other objects of fandom, potentially in terms of leading people off into further consumption. So I guess there's also the question of this is depicting a Game of Thrones fan. So with presenting this sort of fan-like knowledge, and knowledge is a very important part of fan practices, becomes part of the more general popular culture discourse. So in view of knowledge, I would consider myself a fan of Jim Henson's work of the Muppets and the Muppets on Sesame Street. And so, for example, this book, which has lots of concept sketches of Kermit the Frog and Big Bird and all sorts of things, is interesting to me because I want to learn more about where these things come from. So I have consumed this, I've paid for this book, in order to gain more knowledge about the thing that I'm interested in. And I guess the biggest part of the idea of fandom becoming mainstream is something like Zing in Charlestown and other such stores elsewhere that specifically cater to selling popular culture fan products. So I'll leave that there. Thank you for watching, and please watch the rest of the videos. And I look forward to seeing you and chatting to you in the workshop. Please feel free to make comments below this video on any of the questions I've asked, any of the videos. That would be awesome. I'd love to hear what you think. Okay, thanks. Bye.